In the spring of 1962, the Vatican condemned an American film actress by name, and only her. Elizabeth Taylor, then in Rome filming Cleopatra opposite the Welsh actor Richard Burton, had drawn from the Holy See a description that followed her for the rest of her life: erotic vagrancy. Burton, the other half of the relationship, escaped unnamed. Over the 14 years after that ruling, the two of them married twice, divorced twice, appeared together in 11 films, and assembled one of the largest private fortunes ever accumulated by two working actors. So was the marriage genuinely worse than Hollywood ever admitted? Or does the private record, the diaries and the correspondence that reached print only after both of them were beyond embarrassment, describe something the newspapers of the day never managed to reach? Join me to find out. The affair started on a film set. Taylor and Burton met as co-stars on Cleopatra. The production that had brought them both to Rome, and the relationship that developed there, became public property at a speed neither of them could control. She had arrived in the city as the wife of the singer, Eddie Fisher, and the collision between that fact and the daily photographs coming off the production gave the Italian and American press a story they could run almost indefinitely. Denials of the kind the studios preferred never came. A second phrase attached itself to the same episode and has been misremembered ever since. Le Scandale, the label most often repeated in later retellings, came out of the press rather than the church, a colloquialism reporters found easier to print than the Vatican's Latinate scolding. Vagabondagio erotico was a ruling. Le Scandale was a headline. What the condemnation could not do was damage the box office. The scandal, whatever it cost the two of them privately, converted into commercial value almost immediately, and the film industry noticed within months rather than years. By the following year, studios were casting Taylor and Burton in stories that played their own headlines back to the audience with barely any disguise applied. The morality of 1962 had made them notorious, and notoriety, as the decade that followed would demonstrate at length, sold tickets. They married on 15 March 1964 in Montreal. The ceremony closed a 2-year stretch in which the two of them had ranked among the most publicly discussed people in the film industry, and it converted an adultery story into a marriage story, which the newspapers found only marginally less profitable than the version they were losing. Nothing about the arrangement pointed toward privacy. Publicly, Burton and Taylor performed a version of themselves that the studios paid for and the press reproduced without much skepticism. Privately, according to the diaries and letters that would not reach print for decades, they read constantly, wrote to each other in the vocabulary of people who took books seriously, and watched each other's drinking with a clarity that neither of them acted upon. The gap between those two records is the actual subject of this video. Across the marriage and the years surrounding it, Burton and Taylor appeared together in 11 films. That volume achieved something for the studios that individual casting could not. It sold the marriage. The VIPS, released in 1963, put the point beyond argument. Taylor played an adulterous wife attempting to leave her husband, and Burton played the estranged millionaire she was leaving, a piece of casting that reproduced the previous year's headlines almost without disguise. Audiences arriving at the cinema were not being asked to suspend disbelief. They were being invited to watch the scandal they had already followed in print, performed by the two people who had lived through it. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf followed the same commercial logic on a larger scale, and the pattern repeated across the decade that came after. The couple's public dysfunction never functioned as an accident the studios reluctantly tolerated. It operated as a product they purchased deliberately, and the two actors were contractually obliged to perform and to inhabit it in front of a camera. Some portion of the damage, then, had been commissioned and paid for in advance. That is a strange position for any two married people to occupy, and it complicates every account of the marriage written since. Estimates put the couple's combined earnings across the decade at around $80 million. Measured against the money of the period, the figure is enormous, and the two of them spent at a rate that kept pace with it, on art, on luxury travel, and above all, on jewelry. Very little of it went into anything that could be described as security. Keeping money on that scale required a structure, and the structure they built was deliberate rather than improvised. The couple established their legal residence in Celigny, in Switzerland, which removed them from the reach of British and American taxation in a way no accountant's arrangement alone could have managed. They lived nomadically aboard their yacht, the Charisma, and registered major assets through a corporate shelter called the Atlantic Corporation. Later accounts sometimes describe the yacht itself as the primary tax shelter, which overstates its role considerably. The Swiss residents did the heavy work, and the yacht mostly kept them moving. The jewelry has outlasted almost everything else about the marriage in public memory. The stone, now known as the Taylor-Burton diamond, weighed 69.42 carats, and when it went to auction, Cartier took it for $1,050,000. Burton bought it from Cartier the following day for $1,100,000. The extra $50,000 purchased nothing whatsoever except the 24 hours he had lost by failing to bid himself. Money of that scale did not calm the marriage down. It supplied the couple with the means to avoid every ordinary consequence of their drinking. Since a household that can be relocated between countries by yacht and staffed at any hour of the night never encounters the inconveniences that force most people into some sort of reckoning. The Swiss residence, the corporate shelter, and the jewelry all pulled in one direction. Comfort on that scale postponed the moment when either of them would have to stop. Richard Burton kept a diary, and it did not reach publication until 2012, 28 years after his death. Chris Williams edited the volume for Yale University Press, and what the pages contain bears little resemblance to the boastful chronicle of a hellraiser that the press of the 1960s had trained readers to expect. Burton wrote often, at length, and with an accuracy about his own consumption that few drinkers on his scale ever manage. The entry dated 10 January 1969 is the closest thing this marriage has to a diagnosis written from inside it. Burton set down his own intake of whiskey and brandy for the day, then recorded, with visible alarm, that Taylor had arrived at lunch drunk to the point of incoherence. He had never seen her that way from drink before. The prescribed drugs she was obliged to take, he could account for and expect. The alcohol was something new, and he wrote that he hoped she was all right. What he set down next is the passage that has followed the marriage ever since. Burton described his fear of spending the rest of their lives together in an alcoholic haze, seeing the world, as he put it, through fumes of spirits and cigarette smoke. He called the prospect frightful. The entry belongs to January 1969, 5 years into the first marriage and 5 years before the first divorce, which means the man at the center of the story understood the shape of the ending, while more than half of it remained ahead of him. Nothing in the later record contradicts that page. The drinking escalated through the early 1970s, the public conflicts multiplied, and the first marriage ended in the summer of 1974, with substance abuse named among the causes by everyone who has written about it since. Burton's dread from 1969 now reads less like a fear than a forecast. The most quoted line Burton ever produced about the drinking does not come from the diaries at all. In 1977, a year after the second marriage ended, he told a journalist that he had been sloshed for 5 years, a remark usually attributed to the reporter David Lewin and printed ever since as though lifted straight from his private pages. The words are his. The setting is not what most retellings imply. A confession delivered to a newspaper man in 1977 belongs to a different category of document from an entry written in fear in January 1969. One was composed for readers, at a safe distance, about a marriage already finished. The other was written for nobody. That misattribution keeps company with several others, and anyone building this story from the secondary literature inherits all of them. The diamond is regularly printed at 68 carats, with a price of $1,050,000, which merges the stone's actual weight with the sum Cartier paid rather than the sum Burton did. The Vatican's ruling gets swapped for the reporter's nickname. Details of that kind survive by repetition rather than by evidence, and each one makes the marriage slightly more legible and slightly less true. The shouting was constant, and nobody involved ever seriously denied it. Biographers who spoke with people close to the couple describe arguments conducted at volume and frequently in public, followed almost invariably by reconciliation, to the point that several accounts treat the fighting as a kind of foreplay between two people who took a certain pleasure in the performance of it. Friends learned to wait these episodes out. One claim in the literature goes considerably further, and it requires careful handling. In a 2006 biography, J. Randy Taraborelli wrote that Burton had once struck Taylor on the side of the head with enough force to damage her eardrum permanently. No primary source supports the allegation, and no medical record, police report, or contemporaneous account has ever surfaced to corroborate it. The story carries the shape of tabloid material recycled into hardcover long after the fact. It has nonetheless been repeated widely. Burton's family rejects the account outright. His niece, Cyan Owen, told Wales Online in 2013 that the couple traded banter constantly, but that violence never occurred between them, dismissing the claim as absolute rot. A relative's denial does not settle the matter either, and the interests on that side of the argument are obvious enough to anyone reading it. Both positions rest on testimony, and the archive holds nothing that would decide between them. Children lived inside all of this. Burton adopted Taylor's daughter Liza from her marriage to Michael Todd, and he also adopted Maria, a German orphan whose adoption Taylor had initiated during her marriage to Eddie Fisher. The legal record on both adoptions is unambiguous, whatever the surrounding chaos looked like. Whatever the marriage did to the two adults inside it, Burton took on formal legal responsibility for two children who were not his, and he did so while the household around them moved between Switzerland, film locations, and a yacht, with both parents drinking at a rate he was privately documenting. The chaos and the paperwork ran alongside each other. That is the part of the story which resists compression into a headline. The first divorce came through on 26 June 1974 in Switzerland. Years of escalating substance abuse and public conflict had preceded it, and by that point the marriage had exhausted the pattern that once held it together, in which every argument concluded in reconciliation and every reconciliation supplied the raw material for the next argument. 10 years and 3 months had passed since Montreal. They remarried on 10 October 1975 in Botswana, less than 16 months after the divorce was finalized. Nothing in the surviving record indicates that either of them addressed the drinking during the interval, and the reconciliation appears to have followed the same rhythm as every reconciliation before it, only with lawyers and a second ceremony attached. The second marriage lasted 9 months, ending on 29 July 1976, and neither of them attempted a third. Burton married again afterwards. His new wife, Sally Hay Burton, would become a participant in one of the last and most bitter disputes about the first marriage, though that dispute would not surface publicly until long after the funeral. For the moment, the arrangement that had produced 11 films, $80 million, and a 69.42-carat diamond was finished. It had taken 2 attempts and 12 years to end it. A well-informed reader working from the same documents arrives somewhere else entirely, and the argument deserves stating at full strength. Burton's letters and diaries do not describe a man who hated his wife or set out to damage her. They describe a man who revered her, wrote to her with unembarrassed tenderness across more than a decade, and was being killed by a disease he could name. The explosive fights on this reading were theatrical and mutual, a dynamic between passionate equals rather than between an abuser and a victim, which is broadly how the people around them described the arguments at the time. The damage in the marriage was chemical. It was not a matter of malice. The reading holds up against the surviving papers, which is both its strength and its boundary. Those papers were written almost entirely by Burton, and released, in the case of the letters, by Taylor herself, and neither of them was an impartial witness to their own marriage. What the documents record is what the two of them chose to set down and what she later chose to publish. Richard Burton died on 5 August 1984 in Geneva of a cerebral hemorrhage. He died in Switzerland, the country the marriage had selected 2 decades earlier for reasons connected entirely to taxation and not at all to where either of them might want to spend a last summer. 8 years had passed since the final divorce. The coverage of his death nonetheless returned, as coverage of him almost always returned, to Elizabeth Taylor. Because the diaries remained unpublished, public understanding in 1984 rested almost entirely on the newspaper version, assembled between 1962 and 1976, out of drink, money, shouting, and jewels. The interior evidence was still sitting in private hands. The first serious dispute over it began within days of the funeral. Taylor kept Burton's letters and provided them for publication after his death. What they contain is not the correspondence of a man at war with his wife, nor of one performing devotion for an audience he expected to read it. Burton wrote to her about her appearance in terms that had not cooled with familiarity, telling her at one point that she had acquired an added and special, dangerous loveliness. The letters are literate, affectionate, and, in places, frightened. One letter has never been produced. Taylor claimed, years afterwards, that Burton had written to her on 2 August 1984, 3 days before he died, telling her that he wanted to come home. She treated it as the final word on where his attachment had settled, and it entered the popular account of the marriage as a closing scene almost too neat to question. Sally Hay Burton, who was married to him at the time, and with him in Switzerland, has stated firmly that no such letter ever existed and that Burton neither wrote nor posted it. There is no adjudicating between the two accounts. The document has never been shown to a historian. The two women with any claim to knowing gave irreconcilable answers, and each of them had an obvious reason to give the answer she gave. Anyone writing about the marriage has to choose which absence to describe, a lost letter or an invented one. This video began with a question about whether the marriage was worse than Hollywood ever admitted. The public record of the 1960s and 1970s already described it as a drunken, ruinously expensive, permanently quarreling spectacle, and on that specific charge, the newspapers of the period were not exaggerating much. What the private material adds is not additional squalor. It runs, if anything, the other way. The diaries and the letters describe two people who read seriously, wrote well, and understood with terrible precision what alcohol was doing to them, and to each other, several years before it finished the job on Burton. If anything here was worse than the public understood, it lies in that clarity. They watched themselves being destroyed by something they could name accurately, inside a household equipped with enough money to remove every practical obstacle to continuing, while the industry employing them cast them repeatedly in versions of the same collapse and sold tickets to the result. What remains is mostly paper, stone, and carbon. The diaries sit in an edited volume from Yale University Press. The letters have been printed inside a biography that sold partly on the strength of the scandal it quietly corrects. And the diamond that cost Burton an extra $50,000 for a single day's delay has outlived both of the people who owned it. The eardrum story cannot be proved or disproved. The final letter has never been seen by anyone outside the argument about whether it exists. Comments and suggestions for the next video are always welcome below.